For 15 months, a 4-year-old girl was officially missing, and nobody noticed. She had vanished from the foster care system that was supposed to protect her, and the social workers who should have been checking on her had been falsifying their reports, claiming to have visited a child who was already dead. Before we dive into this haunting story, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. And if this case stays with you, hit subscribe, because tomorrow we uncover another story that will linger long after the screen fades to black. The case of Rilya Wilson would expose one of the most catastrophic failures in the history of American child welfare. It would reveal a system so broken, so overwhelmed, so lacking in basic accountability, that a child could disappear for more than a year without anyone raising an alarm. It would lead to the resignation of state officials, the firing of social workers, and reforms that attempted to ensure such a failure could never happen again. But for Rilya, it was too late. She had been failed by everyone who should have protected her. Her mother, lost to addiction and mental illness, her caregivers, who harbored secrets and lies, and the state of Florida, which had taken responsibility for her safety and then abandoned her to her fate. This is the story of Rilya Shanice Wilson, a little girl who fell through the cracks of a system designed to save children like her, and the long road to justice that took more than a decade to travel. Rilya Shanice Wilson was born on April 30th, 1998, in Miami, Florida, to a mother named Gloria Wilson. From the very beginning, Rilya's life was marked by the kind of instability and neglect that child welfare systems exist to address. Gloria suffered from severe mental illness, including schizophrenia, as well as substance abuse problems that had plagued her for years. These conditions made it impossible for her to provide the consistent nurturing care that an infant requires. Gloria's life was a cycle of crisis and chaos. She was homeless at times, living on the streets or in shelters, unable to maintain stable housing. She was incarcerated at other times, her mental illness and addiction leading to brushes with the law. She cycled through treatment programs and hospitals, moments of stability followed by inevitable relapses. Through it all, she tried to care for her daughter, but trying was not enough. A baby needs more than good intentions. A baby needs consistent presence, reliable care, and a safe environment. Gloria could provide none of these. Miami in the late 1990s was a city of stark contrasts, a place where the gleaming towers of downtown and the beautiful beaches of South Beach coexisted with neighborhoods of grinding poverty just a few miles away. In these poorer areas, families struggled with addiction, violence, mental illness, and the daily challenges of survival. The problems were generational, passed down from parents to children in cycles that seemed impossible to break. The child welfare system in Miami-Dade County was overwhelmed by the scale of need. Florida's Department of Children and Families, known as DCF, was responsible for investigating abuse and neglect, providing services to struggling families, and when necessary, removing children from dangerous situations and placing them in foster care. The agency handled thousands of cases each year, far more than its staffing levels could adequately address. Caseworkers in Miami-Dade DCF carried caseloads that were 2 or 3 times higher than professional standards recommended. They were supposed to visit each child regularly, to assess safety, to ensure that placements were working. But with 50, 60, or even more cases per worker, regular visits were impossible. Something had to give, and too often what gave was the careful attention that vulnerable children required. By the time Rilya was a few months old, she had come to the attention of DCF. The circumstances of her birth, Gloria's obvious inability to care for her, and the lack of any stable family support made intervention inevitable. The agency determined that Gloria was unable to provide adequate care for her daughter and took Rilya into protective custody. A judge agreed, finding that Rilya's safety required her removal from her mother's care. It was the beginning of Rilya's journey through the foster care system, a system that was supposed to provide temporary safety while working toward a permanent solution. That solution might be reunification with her mother, if Gloria could address her problems and demonstrate an ability to care for Rilya. Or it might be adoption, if a permanent family could be found to give Rilya the home she deserved. Or, in too many cases, it might be years of foster care with no resolution. Children aging out of the system, at 18, having never found the permanence and stability they needed. Rilya was placed in a series of foster homes over the first 2 years of her life. She was moved from one placement to another, each move documented in a file that grew thicker with each passing month. Some placements were short, lasting only weeks before a problem arose or a better option became available. Others lasted longer, but still ended in transfer, another disruption in the life of a child who needed consistency above all else. Each move meant new caregivers, new surroundings, new faces to learn, and routines to adjust to. For a baby, and then a toddler, these constant changes were developmentally harmful. Young children form attachments to their caregivers, and these attachments are the foundation of healthy emotional development. When attachments are repeatedly broken, children learn that they cannot rely on adults, that relationships are temporary, that safety is an illusion. Rilya was too young to understand what was happening to her, or to articulate her feelings about it, but the effects of her unstable early years would have shaped her, would have made her wary, or clingy, or withdrawn, would have created challenges that any future permanent family would need to address. The files from this period describe Rilya as a sweet child, affectionate when she felt safe, curious about the world around her. She had bright eyes and a smile that could charm the adults who cared for her. She was developing normally in most respects, though the instability of her life had caused some delays. She was, in every way that mattered, a child who deserved better than she was getting. In January 2000, when Rilya was about 20 months old, she was placed in the home of Geraldine Graham. The placement was supposed to be a step toward stability, a foster home where Rilya could stay while the system worked out her long-term future. Graham had been approved as a foster parent, had completed the required training, and had taken in foster children before. On paper, she seemed like a suitable caregiver for a toddler in need. What DCF did not fully appreciate, what their screening processes did not reveal, was the true nature of Geraldine Graham. She was a woman who had learned to manipulate systems and people for her own benefit, who presented a face to authorities that was very different from her true character. She had passed background checks and home inspections because she knew what evaluators were looking for and how to give it to them. Graham saw foster children not as vulnerable young people in need of care and nurturing, but as sources of income. The monthly foster care payments that the state provided could support her lifestyle, and the children themselves required, in her view, only minimal investment. She collected children the way some people collect checks, acquiring them for what they could provide, rather than for what she could give them. This was not a new phenomenon. Foster care systems across the country have struggled with caregivers who are in it for the money rather than for the children. Most foster parents are genuinely motivated by a desire to help, but some see vulnerable children as opportunities for exploitation. The challenge for child welfare agencies is distinguishing between the two, and that challenge is made harder by the desperate shortage of available foster homes. The foster care system in Florida, like systems across the country, paid foster parents a monthly stipend to help cover the costs of caring for children in their homes. The amount varied based on the child's needs, with children who had special requirements receiving higher payments. It was a system designed to ensure that financial constraints did not prevent families from providing homes to children in need, but the system was also susceptible to abuse. Unscrupulous individuals could take in foster children, collect the payments, and provide minimal care in return. Oversight was supposed to prevent this, with social workers conducting regular visits to ensure that children were safe and well cared for. But when oversight failed, when visits were skipped or falsified, children could be exploited or harmed without anyone knowing. Rilya Wilson would become the most devastating example of what happened when oversight failed. For the first year or so of her placement with Geraldine Graham, Rilya appears in the records as a child receiving care. Caseworkers documented visits, noted her condition, described her as progressing appropriately. The paperwork suggested that the placement was working, that Rilya was safe in Graham's home. But the paperwork was a lie. The social worker assigned to Rilya's case, a woman named Deborah Muskelly, had stopped making actual visits. Instead of driving to Graham's home, seeing Rilya with her own eyes, and assessing her welfare, Muskelly had been filling out reports based on phone calls, or simply fabricating information entirely. She documented visits that never happened, described a child she had not seen, and certified that Rilya was safe when she had no way of knowing whether that was true. Why did Muskelly falsify her reports? The reasons were likely a combination of factors common to overburdened child welfare systems. She had too many cases and not enough time. Visiting every child on her caseload as often as regulations required was practically impossible. The pressure to close cases and meet paperwork deadlines encouraged shortcuts. And perhaps she had grown numb to the work, unable to see the children in her files as real people whose lives depended on her diligence. Whatever her reasons, Muskelly's falsifications had fatal consequences. Because while she was writing reports about Rilya's well-being, Rilya had vanished. The exact date of Rilya's disappearance is unknown. What is known is that at some point between late 2000 and early 2001, Rilya was no longer living with Geraldine Graham. Where she went, what happened to her, and who was responsible would take years to determine. But from that point forward, the child that social workers claimed to be monitoring simply did not exist in Graham's home. Graham provided explanations when asked about Rilya's whereabouts. She told people that Rilya had been taken by a relative, that a woman claiming to be from DCF had come to collect her, that arrangements had been made for her to live elsewhere. The stories were vague and shifting, designed to deflect inquiry rather than provide information. The truth was that no one from DCF had taken Rilya. No legitimate transfer had been arranged. If a child was being moved from one placement to another, there would be paperwork, court orders, documentation of the process. None of that existed for Rilya because no legitimate transfer had occurred. Month after month, Rilya remained missing while the system that was supposed to protect her continued to function as if she were still safely in care. Caseworker reports were filed. Foster care payments were made. The bureaucracy churned on, processing a child who was no longer there to be processed. It was not until April 2002, more than 15 months after Rilya is believed to have disappeared, that anyone in authority realized she was missing. The discovery came about almost by accident, during a routine review of cases that was part of an effort to improve the performance of the Miami-Dade DCF office. The review was prompted by concerns about the office's performance metrics. Cases were being closed without proper documentation. Visits were being reported without verification. The patterns suggested systemic problems that needed to be addressed before they led to tragedy. The reviewers didn't know that tragedy had already occurred. A supervisor named Janet Winnikoff was assigned to review a sample of cases, checking documentation against actual child welfare. Rilya Wilson's file was among those she examined. What Winnikoff found raised immediate concerns. The file contained visit reports claiming that caseworker Deborah Muskelly had seen Rilya regularly and that the child was doing well. But when Winnikoff tried to verify these reports, she found inconsistencies. Phone numbers were disconnected. Addresses did not match up. The details in the reports did not align with other documentation in the file. Winnikoff attempted to contact Geraldine Graham directly to arrange a visit and see Rilya with her own eyes. Graham's responses were evasive. She was not available. Rilya was not home. There were always reasons why a visit could not occur immediately. When Winnikoff pressed harder, Graham provided an explanation that immediately raised alarms. She claimed that a woman from DCF had come to take Rilya away, that the child had been transferred to another placement. But there was no record of any such transfer. No court order authorized it. No caseworker had documented it. The story made no sense within the system's procedures. Winnikoff escalated her concerns to her supervisors, who began their own inquiries. Calls were made, records were checked, and the terrible truth began to emerge. Rilya Wilson was missing. She had been missing for more than a year, and no one in the agency responsible for her protection had noticed. The realization hit the Miami-Dade DCF office like a bomb. A child in their care, a child they were legally and morally responsible for, had vanished without a trace, and their own caseworker had been filing false reports claiming to have seen her. The failure was so complete, so catastrophic, that it seemed almost impossible. And yet, it had happened. The revelation that a child could vanish from state custody for more than a year without anyone noticing sent shockwaves through Florida and the nation. How could this happen? How could a system designed to protect vulnerable children lose one so completely? How many other children might be missing without anyone knowing? The news media descended on the story with an intensity that reflected the public's horror and outrage. Television trucks lined up outside the DCF office. Reporters camped out in front of Geraldine Graham's home. The story led newscasts not just in Miami, but across the country, a tale of bureaucratic failure so egregious that it seemed almost fictional. The immediate response was frantic and multifaceted. Law enforcement agencies across Florida were alerted to search for Rilya. Her photograph and description were distributed nationally through the missing children networks that had been established for just such purposes. The public was asked to help find a little girl who had been missing for 15 months, but whose disappearance was only now being announced. The Amber Alert system, still relatively new at the time, was activated. Rilya's face appeared on highway signs, on television screens, in newspapers, and on websites. The search was nationwide, based on the slim hope that she might have been taken somewhere far from Miami, that she might still be alive despite the circumstances. But even as the search began, investigators harbored grim expectations. A toddler who had been missing for more than a year, whose disappearance had been concealed by the person responsible for her care, was unlikely to be found alive. The statistics on missing children were brutal. The longer a child was missing, the lower the chances of a good outcome. And Rilya had been missing for 15 months before anyone even started looking. The search for Rilya Wilson was, from almost the beginning, as much a search for answers as a search for a living child. What had happened to her? Who was responsible? And how had the system failed so completely? The investigation into Rilya's disappearance moved quickly once it began, propelled by public outrage and political pressure that demanded answers and accountability. Geraldine Graham was the obvious focus. She had been Rilya's foster mother. She was the last person known to have had custody of the child. Her explanations for Rilya's absence made no sense and could not be verified. Miami-Dade police detectives and FBI agents worked together on the case, recognizing that a missing child case of this magnitude required all available resources. They established a task force dedicated to finding Rilya and determining what had happened to her. Graham was interviewed repeatedly by detectives who pressed her for the truth about what had happened to Rilya. Her story changed with each telling, a pattern that suggested deception rather than faulty memory. First, she claimed that a woman from DCF had taken Rilya, describing an official visit that had never occurred. Then she said a relative had come for the child, a relative whose identity she could not clearly specify. Then she suggested that Rilya's biological mother had reclaimed her, despite Gloria's obvious incapacity and lack of any legal custody. Each story was investigated and found to be false. No DCF worker had taken Rilya. No relative had claimed her. Gloria had not been in contact with anyone about retrieving her daughter. Graham was lying, and her lies pointed to consciousness of guilt. Police searched Graham's home multiple times, using increasingly sophisticated techniques. They brought in cadaver dogs, trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. They used ground-penetrating radar to check for disturbances in the soil. They examined every inch of the property for any evidence that might indicate what had happened to Rilya. The searches found nothing conclusive. If Rilya had died in that home, if her body had been disposed of on the property, the evidence had been concealed well enough to evade detection. Graham had had more than a year to clean up, to dispose of evidence, to prepare for the possibility that someone might eventually come looking. That time had served her well. The investigation expanded to include the broader failures that had allowed Rilya to vanish. Deborah Muskelly, the social worker who had falsified her reports, was interviewed and eventually fired. Her caseload was examined, and auditors found that her neglect of Rilya was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of inadequate monitoring. The entire Miami-Dade DCF office came under scrutiny. Investigators found systemic problems that went far beyond one caseworker or one missing child. Caseloads were impossibly high. Supervision was inadequate. Training was insufficient. The conditions that had allowed Rilya to vanish existed throughout the system, affecting hundreds or thousands of other children. In the wake of Rilya's case, Florida Governor Jeb Bush ordered a review of all children in the state's foster care system. The review was intended to account for every child, to ensure that no other Rilyas were missing without anyone knowing. What the review found was disturbing. Hundreds of children could not be immediately located. Most were eventually found safe, their locations simply not properly recorded in the system. But the fact that such a review was necessary at all demonstrated how profoundly broken the system had become. The political fallout was significant. The Secretary of the Florida Department of Children and Families resigned. Multiple DCF employees in the Miami-Dade office were fired or disciplined. The state legislature held hearings and allocated additional resources to child welfare. Reforms were proposed and implemented, all in an attempt to ensure that what happened to Rilya could never happen again. But even as the system reformed around her case, Rilya Wilson remained missing. Months turned into years. The initial urgency of the search faded, replaced by the grim recognition that Rilya was almost certainly dead. The question was no longer whether she would be found alive, but whether her body would ever be recovered and whether her killer would ever face justice. Geraldine Graham remained the prime suspect, but prosecuting her without a body presented significant challenges. Prosecutors needed evidence that Rilya was dead and evidence that Graham was responsible. Without remains, without witnesses to the crime, without a confession, building a case that could satisfy the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt was extremely difficult. Graham was charged with other crimes while the investigation continued. She had committed welfare fraud, collecting foster care payments for Rilya long after the child had disappeared. She had obstructed the investigation with her lies and evasions. These charges could keep her in custody, while investigators worked to build a murder case. The years passed slowly. The investigation continued, following every lead, pursuing every possibility. Investigators interviewed everyone who had known Graham, who had been in her home, who might have seen or heard something relevant. They searched additional locations based on tips and theories. They waited for someone to come forward with information that might break the case open. The break finally came through the persistence of investigators and the accumulation of evidence, both physical and circumstantial. While Rilya's body was never found, prosecutors eventually determined that they had enough evidence to charge Geraldine Graham with murder. The case against Graham was built on multiple pillars. First, there was the evidence that Rilya had been in Graham's exclusive care when she disappeared. Graham had no credible explanation for what had happened to the child, and her changing stories suggested consciousness of guilt. Second, there was evidence that Graham had continued to collect foster care payments for Rilya after the child was gone, a strong indication that she knew Rilya was not coming back and wanted to profit from her disappearance. Third, there were statements from people who had known Graham, some of whom reported disturbing behavior, and comments that suggested she had harmed children in her care. These witnesses painted a picture of a woman who was not the nurturing foster mother she had presented herself to be. Fourth, there was evidence about the treatment of other children in Graham's home, including her own adopted daughter and other foster children. This evidence suggested a pattern of abuse and neglect that made it plausible that Graham would harm a child like Rilya. In 2011, nearly 10 years after Rilya's disappearance was discovered, Geraldine Graham was charged with first-degree murder. The charge was filed despite the absence of a body, based on the circumstantial evidence that prosecutors had assembled over years of investigation. The decision to prosecute was not without risk. Cases without bodies are notoriously difficult to win. Defense attorneys would surely argue that without remains, there was no proof that Rilya was even dead, much less that Graham had killed her. The prosecution would have to convince a jury that the evidence, taken together, proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial of Geraldine Graham began in February 2013 in a Miami-Dade County courtroom, more than a decade after Rilya had vanished. The case had taken 11 years to bring to trial, a timeline that reflected both the difficulty of prosecuting a murder without a body and the complexity of the evidence that needed to be assembled. Judge Gerald Bagley presided over the proceedings in a courtroom packed with observers. The case had never lost its hold on the public's attention, even after all these years. Rilya Wilson had become a symbol of system failure, and the trial of her accused killer was the closest thing to closure that the case would ever provide. The prosecution team, led by Assistant State Attorney Kathleen Hogue, had spent years building the case. They had interviewed hundreds of witnesses, analyzed thousands of documents, and constructed a narrative that they believed would prove Graham's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutor Hogue's opening statement laid out the case against Graham in stark terms. She described a woman who had taken in foster children for money, who had abused and neglected the children in her care, and who had killed Rilya Wilson when the child became inconvenient. She promised to present evidence that would show what had happened in that house, what Graham had done to Rilya, and how she had covered up her crime for years. Rilya Wilson was a 4-year-old child who deserved protection, Hogue told the jury. Instead, she got Geraldine Graham, and Geraldine Graham killed her. The prosecution called witnesses who had known Graham, who had been in her home, who could speak to her character and behavior. Former foster children described mistreatment and neglect. Neighbors described concerns they had harbored about what was happening inside that house. The picture that emerged was of a household where children were not nurtured, but exploited. One witness, a woman named Pamela Graham, no relation to Geraldine, had lived with the defendant for a time during the period when Rilya was in the home. Her testimony painted a disturbing picture of a household where children were mistreated, where basic needs went unmet, where the foster care payments were valued more than the children who generated them. Pamela described seeing Rilya in the home, a small child who seemed withdrawn and wary. She described hearing sounds that might have been abuse, that she had tried to ignore or explain away at the time. She described her own guilt at not having done more, at not having reported what she suspected. The most powerful witness was Robin Lunsford, who had known Geraldine Graham for years and who would provide the direct evidence of guilt that the prosecution needed. Lunsford had been reluctant to come forward for years, afraid of Graham, uncertain whether her testimony would be believed. But eventually, she had decided that she could no longer keep silent about what she knew. Lunsford testified that Graham had confided in her about what happened to Rilya, had admitted to causing the child's death in a moment of rage. According to Lunsford, Graham had described how Rilya had soiled herself, a normal occurrence for a toddler still learning bladder control. Graham had reacted with violent anger, had beaten Rilya severely, had struck the child's head, and Rilya had died from the injuries. The testimony was detailed and devastating. Lunsford described Graham's demeanor as, she confessed, the casual way she discussed killing a child, the lack of remorse or horror in her voice. Graham had described disposing of the body, though she had not specified where. She had explained how she planned to conceal the crime, to continue collecting foster care payments, to maintain the illusion that Rilya was still alive. She told me she killed that baby, Lunsford testified, her voice steady but emotional. She said the baby made a mess, and she lost her temper, and she beat her, and then the baby died. And she got rid of the body. The defense, led by attorney Scott Sakin, faced the challenge of countering testimony that, if believed, was essentially a confession. Sakin's strategy was to attack the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, to suggest that they had motives to lie, that their testimony should not be trusted. Sakin was an experienced defense attorney who understood that in a case without a body, the prosecution's burden was particularly heavy. He needed to create reasonable doubt, to give the jury a reason to question whether the evidence proved what the prosecution claimed it proved. He cross-examined Lunsford aggressively, challenging her motives, her memory, and her reliability. He pointed out that she had waited years to come forward, suggested that she might have reasons to fabricate testimony against Graham, and highlighted inconsistencies in her accounts over time. You're asking this jury to send a woman to prison for life based on a story that you didn't tell anyone for years, Sakin said during cross-examination. A story that has changed and grown over time. A story that cannot be verified because there is no body, no physical evidence, nothing but your word. Sakin also presented an alternative theory of what might have happened to Rilya. He suggested that the child might have been taken by someone else, that Graham's various explanations might have contained elements of truth, that the real story of Rilya's disappearance might never be known. In the absence of certainty, he argued, the jury could not convict. The defense called its own witnesses, including character witnesses, who described Graham in more positive terms than the prosecution's witnesses had. They portrayed her as a woman who had tried to help children, who had opened her home when others would not, who was now being unfairly accused of a crime she did not commit. In closing arguments, Prosecutor Hogue summarized the evidence and asked the jury to hold Graham accountable. She acknowledged that the case was unusual, that prosecuting a murder without a body required the jury to draw conclusions from circumstantial evidence. But she argued that the evidence, taken together, left no reasonable doubt about what had happened. Rilya Wilson is dead, Hogue said. She has been dead for more than 11 years. She was killed by the woman who was supposed to care for her, killed because she had an accident that any toddler might have, killed because Geraldine Graham valued money over human life. The evidence proves this. Justice demands that you hold her accountable. Defense attorney Sakin made his final appeal to reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury that the burden of proof was on the prosecution, that Graham was presumed innocent, that a verdict of guilty required certainty rather than suspicion. "Where is Rilya Wilson?" Sakin asked. "The prosecution cannot tell you. They cannot show you a body. They cannot prove how she died, or when she died, or even that she is dead. All they have is speculation, suspicion, and the testimony of witnesses who have every reason to lie. That is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That is guesswork." The jury deliberated for approximately 10 hours, a length that suggested serious consideration of the evidence and arguments. During those hours, they reviewed testimony, examined evidence, and debated among themselves about what the evidence proved. On March 15, 2013, they returned to the courtroom with their verdict. The four persons stood and read the decision, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Rilya Wilson. The courtroom erupted in emotion when the verdict was read. Family members of Rilya, who had waited so long for justice, wept. Advocates who had worked on the case embraced. Even prosecutors who had spent years building the case showed visible relief that their efforts had succeeded. Graham showed little reaction to the verdict. She was led away in handcuffs, beginning the journey to the prison cell, where she would spend the rest of her life. The sentencing hearing that followed gave those affected by Rilya's death an opportunity to speak. Family members addressed the court, describing what Rilya's loss had meant to them, the years of uncertainty, the pain of knowing that a child they loved had been killed and discarded. Gloria Wilson, Rilya's biological mother, was not present at the sentencing. Her mental illness and the circumstances of her life had kept her largely absent from the case. But others spoke on Rilya's behalf, giving voice to a child who had never had the chance to speak for herself. Judge Gerald Bagley sentenced Geraldine Graham to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the harshest sentence available under Florida law for first-degree murder, in a case where the death penalty was not sought. Graham would die in prison, having never admitted what she did to Rilya, having never revealed where the child's remains were disposed of. "You took this baby, you abused her, and you killed her," Judge Bagley said during sentencing, "and then you lied about it for years. You showed no remorse then, and you show no remorse now. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, and that is what justice requires." The conviction of Geraldine Graham brought closure of a kind to the case of Rilya Wilson, but it could not undo the failures that had allowed the tragedy to occur. Rilya's body has never been found. The exact circumstances of her death remain known only to her killer. The questions about how the system could have failed so completely continue to resonate. The legacy of Rilya Wilson extends far beyond her individual case. Her disappearance and death became a catalyst for comprehensive reform of Florida's child welfare system and influenced child welfare policy across the nation. The failures that allowed her to vanish became a case study in what can go wrong when systems meant to protect children are underfunded, understaffed, and inadequately supervised. In the immediate aftermath of the case, Florida implemented significant changes to how it tracked and monitored children in foster care. The most visible change was the development of a new computer system, the Florida Safe Families Network, designed to maintain accurate, real-time records of every child's location and status. The old system had been fragmented, with different databases in different offices, making it impossible to get a comprehensive picture of any child's situation. The new system was intended to create a single, unified record that could be accessed by anyone who needed to know where a child was. Requirements for caseworker visits were strengthened significantly, with verification measures to ensure that visits actually occurred. Under the old system, caseworkers self-reported their visits, creating the opportunity for falsification that Deborah Muskelly had exploited. Under the new system, visits had to be documented with details that could be verified, including specific observations about the child's condition and signatures from caregivers confirming that visits had taken place. Caseload standards were revised to give workers more time to devote to each child. The crushing caseloads that had contributed to Rilya's death were recognized as a structural problem that could not be solved by individual effort alone. Florida committed to hiring additional caseworkers and supervisors, reducing the average caseload to levels that made meaningful engagement with each child possible. Supervision and oversight were enhanced at every level of the agency. The failure of Deborah Muskelly's supervisors to catch her falsified reports showed that the problem was not just one caseworker, but a system that did not adequately monitor its own employees. New protocols required supervisors to verify casework independently, to accompany workers on visits periodically, and to review documentation with a more critical eye. The Rilya Wilson Act was passed by the Florida legislature in 2002, mandating specific reforms designed to prevent similar tragedies. The law was named for Rilya as a permanent reminder of what could happen when the system failed, a memorial in legislative form. Under the Rilya Wilson Act, DCF was required to conduct more frequent face-to-face contact between caseworkers and children in care. The minimum frequency of visits was increased, and visits had to include private time with the child, away from caregivers, to give children the opportunity to disclose problems they might not feel safe revealing in front of adults. The law established new accountability measures for caseworkers and supervisors, including disciplinary actions for falsifying records and requirements for immediate reporting when a child could not be located. Caseworkers who failed to maintain proper documentation or who could not account for children in their caseloads faced consequences up to and including termination and loss of professional licensure. The law also created penalties for failing to report a missing child and for obstructing investigations into a child's whereabouts. The delay in discovering Rilya's disappearance was partly due to the lack of urgency about locating children whose whereabouts were uncertain. The new law required immediate escalation when a child could not be found, treating any failure to locate a child as a potential emergency. Perhaps most significantly, the law required the creation of a system for tracking children through every stage of the child welfare process, from initial removal through eventual permanency, whether that meant reunification, adoption, or aging out of the system. No child in Florida's foster care would be allowed to become a number in a file, lost in the bureaucracy, forgotten by the system that was supposed to protect them. These reforms were significant, representing a genuine effort to address the failures that had allowed Rilya to vanish. But child welfare advocates noted that reform was only as good as its implementation. Laws could be passed and policies could be written, but without adequate funding, without enough caseworkers, without a culture that prioritized children's safety above bureaucratic convenience, the same failures could happen again. The implementation of the reforms faced challenges from the beginning. Hiring enough caseworkers to meet the new caseload standards required funding that was not always available. Training caseworkers to use the new computer system took time and resources. Changing the culture of an agency that had operated one way for years was a gradual process, not an overnight transformation. And despite the reforms, other children continued to die or disappear from Florida's foster care system in the years after Rilya's case. Each new tragedy prompted additional scrutiny, additional reforms, additional promises that lessons had been learned. The pattern suggested that the fundamental challenges of child welfare, the overwhelming need, the limited resources, the difficulty of predicting which families would become dangerous, were not easily solved by any single set of reforms. The Rilya Wilson Act became a model for other states, which examined Florida's response and considered similar reforms for their own child welfare systems. The case had demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, what could happen when child welfare systems failed. Other states wanted to prevent similar failures in their own jurisdictions. In the years since Rilya's case, other children have died or disappeared from child welfare systems across the country. Each tragedy prompts new calls for reform, new investigations, new promises that lessons have been learned, and yet the fundamental challenges remain. Too many children in need, too few resources to serve them, and a system that sometimes loses sight of its mission amid the overwhelming volume of cases. Rilya Wilson has become a symbol of these ongoing failures. Her name invoked whenever child welfare reform is debated. She represents the children who fall through the cracks, who are failed by the very systems designed to save them, who disappear without anyone noticing until it is too late. Her case is taught in social work programs as an example of what can go wrong, a cautionary tale meant to inspire vigilance and dedication. The social worker who falsified reports about Rilya, Deborah Muskelly, faced consequences for her actions, but not criminal prosecution. She was fired from DCF immediately after the discovery of Rilya's disappearance, and subsequently lost her social work license, effectively ending her career in the field. Her failure was framed as professional misconduct rather than criminal negligence, a distinction that frustrated some who believed she should have faced more severe penalties. Muskelly's case raised difficult questions about accountability in child welfare that continued to be debated. She was one caseworker among thousands, operating in a system that made the kind of corner-cutting she engaged in almost inevitable. Her caseload was impossibly high, at times exceeding 50 families, when professional standards recommended no more than 15. Her supervision was inadequate, with supervisors who were themselves overwhelmed and unable to provide meaningful oversight. The pressures she faced were real, the product of systemic underfunding and understaffing that was not her fault. Does that excuse her falsification of records? Does it shift responsibility to the system rather than the individual? The answers to these questions depend on how one views the relationship between individual responsibility and systemic failure. Muskelly made choices that contributed to Rilya's death, choices that were wrong and that violated her professional obligations. But she made those choices in a context that made wrong choices almost inevitable. Some argued that criminally prosecuting Muskelly would have been unjust, that she was being scapegoated for failures that were really the responsibility of legislators who underfunded the system and administrators who failed to address caseload problems. Others argued that accountability required consequences for individuals, that allowing Muskelly to escape prosecution sent a message that falsifying child welfare records was acceptable as long as you could blame the system. In the end, Muskelly was not prosecuted, and the question of whether she should have been remains debated. What is clear is that when caseworkers fail, children suffer, and that preventing such failures requires both individual accountability and systemic reform. Rilya's biological mother, Rilya Wilson, remains a tragic figure in this story, a woman whose mental illness and addiction had made it impossible for her to care for her daughter. She was not capable of protecting Rilya herself, but she had trusted that the system would do what she could not. That trust was betrayed, not by malice, but by incompetence and neglect. Gloria has spoken occasionally about her daughter over the years, in moments of lucidity between episodes of illness. Her statements reflect grief and confusion about what happened, a mother's pain filtered through the fog of mental illness. She was not a good mother to Rilya, could not be a good mother given her circumstances. But she loved her daughter in whatever way she was capable of love. The relationship between Gloria and Rilya is a reminder of the complexity of child welfare cases. Gloria was not a villain. She was a victim herself of mental illness and addiction and a life that had offered her few opportunities. The state took Rilya from her, not as punishment, but as protection, recognizing that Gloria could not provide what a child needed. The state promised to do better, to give Rilya the safety and stability that Gloria could not provide. The state failed. Rilya's body has never been found, a fact that denies her family the closure of burial and denies the justice system the certainty of physical evidence. Geraldine Graham has never revealed where she disposed of Rilya's remains, if she even remembers after all these years. The child who fell through the cracks of the system remains lost even in death. The home where Rilya lived with Geraldine Graham still stands in Miami, an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood that belies the horror that occurred within its walls. Most of those who pass it have no idea of its history, no knowledge of the little girl who lived there and died there and was never seen again. The house keeps its secrets, as houses do, indifferent to the human tragedies that unfold within their walls. The neighborhood has changed in the years since Rilya's death, as neighborhoods do, with residents moving in and out, families coming and going, the normal rhythms of urban life continuing, regardless of what happened in one particular house on one particular street. Some of the neighbors who lived there in 2000 and 2001 have moved away. Others remain, carrying memories of the search, of the news trucks, of the terrible moment when they learned what had happened to the little girl they might have seen playing in the yard. Geraldine Graham remains in prison, serving her life sentence at the Lowell Correctional Institution, a women's facility in north central Florida. She has never admitted to killing Rilya, has never revealed where the child's body was disposed of, has never shown the remorse that might bring some measure of peace to those who loved Rilya. She is in her 60s now, and she will die in prison, taking her secrets with her. Graham has filed appeals over the years, as prisoners do, challenging various aspects of her conviction. None have been successful. The evidence against her, while circumstantial, was sufficient to convince a jury, beyond a reasonable doubt, and appellate courts have found no errors that would warrant overturning the verdict. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, a small measure of justice for a crime that can never truly be made right. The foster care system that failed Rilya continues to struggle with the same fundamental challenges that allowed her to vanish. There are still too many children in need of protection. There are still too few caseworkers to serve them adequately. There are still foster homes where children are mistreated, still caregivers who see vulnerable children as sources of income rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. Progress has been made since Rilya's case. The reforms implemented in Florida have made it harder for children to disappear unnoticed. The technology has improved, the oversight has been enhanced, and the awareness of the potential for failure has been heightened. But progress is not perfection, and the system continues to fail children, though perhaps less catastrophically than it failed Rilya. The child welfare workers who labor in this system deserve recognition for the difficulty of their work. Most are dedicated professionals who entered the field because they wanted to help children. They work long hours for modest pay, dealing with situations that would break most people. They see abuse and neglect on a daily basis, make decisions that affect children's lives, and carry the weight of responsibility for the most vulnerable members of society. These workers are not the problem. The problem is a society that has never adequately funded the systems meant to protect its children, that has never given child welfare the resources and attention it deserves. The caseworkers who struggle with impossible caseloads are doing their best in a system that sets them up to fail. When failures occur, they are often blamed, but the true responsibility lies with all of us. With a society that has not made child welfare a genuine priority. Rilya Wilson has become a name that means something in child welfare circles, a shorthand for the kind of catastrophic failure that must never be allowed to happen again. Her case is studied in social work programs, referenced in policy discussions, invoked in budget debates. She has become, in death, an advocate for the vulnerable children she was in life. But Rilya Wilson was more than a case study, more than a symbol, more than a name attached to legislation. She was a little girl with bright eyes and a tentative smile, a child who had already seen more instability in her 4 years than most people experience in a lifetime. She had likes and dislikes, fears and hopes, the beginnings of a personality that would never be allowed to develop. We will never know who Rilya might have become if she had been given the chance to grow up. We will never know what she might have accomplished, what joy she might have brought to the world, what contributions she might have made. That future was stolen from her. First, by a mother who couldn't care for her, then by a foster mother who killed her, and finally by a system that did not notice she was gone. What we can do, what we must do, is ensure that her death meant something. We can demand better for the children who are still in foster care, still depending on systems that too often fail them. We can insist on adequate funding for child welfare, on reasonable caseloads for workers, on genuine oversight that catches problems before they become tragedies. We can remember Rilya, and in remembering her, recommit ourselves to protecting the most vulnerable among us. The photograph of Rilya Wilson that was distributed when her disappearance was finally discovered shows a child who deserved so much better than she got. She looks out from that photograph with an expression that might be hope or might be wariness, the look of a child who has learned not to expect too much from the world. She was right to be wary. The world failed her comprehensively and completely. The mother who should have cared for her could not. The foster mother who promised to protect her killed her. The system that was supposed to watch over her lost track of her entirely. Everyone who had a responsibility to Rilya Wilson failed to meet it. We cannot undo those failures. We cannot bring Rilya back. We cannot give her the childhood she deserved, the life she should have had, the future that was stolen from her. But we can honor her memory by fighting for the children who are still here, who are still depending on systems that may or may not protect them, who are still waiting for the safety and stability that every child deserves. Rilya Shanaisa Wilson was 4 years old. She had spent most of her short life in the foster care system, moved from placement to placement, never finding the permanence and love that every child deserves. She was failed by her mother, who could not care for her. She was failed by her foster mother, who killed her. She was failed by the system that was supposed to protect her. Her photograph shows a little girl who looks out at the world with eyes that have seen too much. She deserved better. They all deserve better. We remember Rilya Wilson. We honor her memory by demanding better for the children who are still with us. We cannot change the past, but we can change the future. That is all we can do. That is everything we must do. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones.